One of the things his cousin had been invited for was that Paul should get used to her eccentric colour, a colour of which, on a certain bright Sunday of July, Mrs. Beaver noted afresh, with some alarm, the exaggerated pitch. Her young friend had arrived 2 days before, and now, during the elastic interval from church to luncheon, had been dispatched to Bounds with a message and some preliminary warnings. Jean knew that she should find there a house in some confusion, a new-born little girl, the first, a young mother not yet up, and an odd visitor, somewhat older than herself, in the person of Miss Armiger, a school friend of Mrs. Bream, who had made her appearance a month before that of the child, and had stayed on, as Mrs. Beaver with some emphasis put it, right through everything. This picture of the situation had filled, after the first hour or two, much of the time of the two ladies, but it had originally included for Jean no particular portrait of the head of the family, an omission in some degree repaired, however, by the chance of Mrs. Beaver's having on the Saturday morning taken her for a moment into the bank. They had had errands in the town, and Mrs. Beaver had wished to speak to Mr. Bream, a brilliant, joking gentleman, who, instantly succumbing to their invasion and turning out a confidential clerk, had received them in his beautiful private room. "Shall I like him?" Jean, with the sense of a widening circle, had before this adventurously asked. "Oh, yes, if you notice him," Mrs. Beaver had replied, in obedience to an odd private prompting to mark him as insignificant. Later on at the bank, the girl noticed him enough to feel rather afraid of him. That was always with her the foremost result of being noticed herself. If Mrs. Beaver passed him over, this was in part to be accounted for by all that at Eastmead was usually taken for granted. The Queen Mother, as Anthony Bream kept up the jest of calling her, would not have found it easy to paint offhand a picture of the allied sovereign whom she was apt to regard as a somewhat restless vassal. Though he was a dozen years older than the happy young prince on whose behalf she exercised her regency, she had known him from his boyhood, and his strong points and his weak were alike an old story to her. His house was new. He had, on his marriage, at a vast expense, made it quite violently so. His wife and his child were new. New also in a marked degree was the young woman who had lately taken up her abode with him, and who had the air of intending to remain till she should lose that quality. But Tony himself, this had always been his name to her, was intensely familiar. Never doubting that he was a subject she'd mastered, Mrs. Beaver had no impulse to clear up her view by distributing her impressions. These impressions were as neatly pigeonholed as her correspondence and her accounts. Neatly, at least, save in so far as they were besprinkled with the dust of time. One of them might have been freely rendered into a hint that her young partner was a possible source of danger to her own sex. Not to her personally, of course. For herself, somehow, Mrs. Beaver was not of her own sex. If she had been a woman, she never thought of herself so loosely, she would, in spite of her age, have doubtless been conscious of peril. She now recognized none in life, except that of Paul's marrying wrong, against which she'd taken early measures. It would have been a misfortune, therefore, to feel a flaw in a security otherwise so fine. Was not, perhaps, the fact that she had a vague sense of exposure for Jean Martle a further motive for her not expatiating to that young lady on Anthony Bream? If any such sense operated, I hasten to add, it operated without Jean's having mentioned that at the bank he had struck her as formidable. Let me not fail equally to declare that Mrs. Beaver's general suspicion of him, as our sad want of signs for shades and degrees condemns me to call it, rested on nothing in the nature of evidence. If she had ever really uttered it, she might have been brought up rather short on the question of grounds. There were certainly, at any rate, no grounds in Tony's having, before church, sent a word over to her on the subject of their coming to luncheon. "Dear Julia, this morning is really grand," he'd written. "We've just managed to move to her downstairs room, where they put up a lovely bed, and where the sight of all her things cheers and amuses her, to say nothing of the wide immediate outlook at her garden and her own corner of the terrace. In short, the waves are going down, and we're beginning to have our meals regular. Luncheon